Hello again, guys. Let's talk about data collection. So we've talked a lot in the quantitative piece about all of the different types of data that you can collect in quantitative designs, either through using an instrument like a scale or a tape measure or something like that to measure physical things, or using a scale in terms of a questionnaire, or in the form of a questionnaire, I should say, to measure more abstract concepts. We also talk about using things like test scores, those types of things. What they all have in common is that they give us numerical data that we can then process using some type of statistical test. Qualitative data is not quite as neat as a lovely set of numbers. Qualitative data is typically data in the form of words, or something visual like an image or a video. Qualitative data collection generally takes place through these three kinds of data. The first type of data is interviews, second is observation, and third is document analysis. So interviews, if we think about what an interview essentially is it's one person having a conversation with another person, right? Two people having a conversation. It could be more than two people having a conversation. An interview, just like you see it on television with, Barbara Walters interviewing President Obama, for example, would be an interview, same as you would do an interview in qualitative data. So interviews can take many forms. We typically think of them as the one-on-one interview that I just mentioned, a one-on-one face-to-face interview, like what we see on television. Sometimes you'll see one interviewer and maybe a group of 5 or 6 people. This is a focus group where 5 or 6 participants are answering the interview questions kind of together. I know, especially during political seasons, on CNN, for example, they'll do these kind of town hall things where there's one person who's kind of asking questions, and then a group of 6 people are sitting kind of in this awkward line answering these questions. So a focus group, when you have an interview with multiple participants, is called a focus group. An interview with just kind of one person is called an individual interview. Both of these could be face-to-face. Sometimes we do interviews over the phone, over Skype. There could be lots of ways of doing it. Another form of interview is when we send somebody a prompt and we collect their response. So let's say I send somebody each week, I send them a question that I want them to kind of journal about in email and email it back to me. I'm not actually talking to them, but it's still an interview because I'm specifically asking questions and they're answering questions specific to the purpose of my research. And I'll contrast that with document analysis in a minute to explain why we make that differentiation. Observations are exactly what they sound like. For both of these, interviews and observations, you may recall them from quantitative. Interviews just have to do with talking to someone. Observations just have to do with watching someone. If you are reading a survey out to somebody and filling in their multiple choice answers for them, technically, yes, that's an interview, but it's not a qualitative interview, right? Qualitative interview, I want to ask people questions and get these long, open-ended responses. Observations in quantitative could be I have some type of protocol and I'm writing down how many times I see little Jimmy jump in the playground. Or I might observe and write down, how often a certain runner uses a certain technique while running. Both of those would be quantitative observations. Qualitative observations are more free-flowing. You're just kind of describing what you see in a particular moment. So if you went to the mall, for example, and observed teenagers and kind of how they hang out with each other, in this public space where their parents aren't around, you're not going to go with a checklist looking for certain behaviors, right? You might notice that they stand together or that they're all wearing a similar type of clothing, or maybe they stay by certain places in the mall. Maybe, there's more, males than females, those types of things. None of that would be on a checklist. Those are just things that you notice that you're writing down. When we make these notes, we call them field notes. So if you hear me refer to field notes, I'm talking about the data that we're writing down while we're out in the field collecting data. So observations and interviews in this paradigm are those things that are more open-ended and they are things that we are collecting for the specific purpose of research. So all of the data that is being generated, created, and by created I mean my field notes and my interview transcripts, I've created that content for the purpose of my research. Document analysis down here is a little bit different. It's still going to be analyzed using qualitative methods, qualitative strategies for analyzing data. However, it's going to differ a little bit in that for document analysis, it's generally things, items, transcripts, observations, videos, photographs, etc., that were not created for the purpose of my research study, but that I'm thinking I could potentially learn something from. So an example of this would be several years ago whenever Barack Obama was first running for president and he was running against John McCain. There was a lot of coverage in the news. They always bring in, the potential first ladies, their wives, and they end up getting kind of sucked into the news cycle, right? And so what this author did was he collected all the newspaper articles that talked about Cindy McCain, John McCain's wife, and he collected all the articles that talked about Michelle Obama, Barack Obama's wife. And what he found by analyzing them and kind of the major themes and major ideas that came out of it, which is essentially what we're doing with qualitative analysis, we're looking for those major ideas and themes. What he noticed is that the way that the two women were treated, the way that they were described, just the overall manner in which media discussed them and what their expectations were very different for the two women. So the data in that sense were those newspaper articles. But those newspaper articles were not collected, they were not created for the purpose of his research study, right? They were created for the purpose of a newspaper, to share information, to communicate to the world broadly, not to do research per se. So what the catch to that is that we don't have an instrument. We can't ask specific questions. He could not go to them and specifically say, like, can you tell me why you discuss Cindy McCain's appearance differently than you discuss Michelle Obama's experience, for example, appearance. And so we're kind of just left with working with what we have there. Whenever we look at historical methods, so anytime somebody pulls up, let's say, an old Civil War general's diary, for example, or letters they wrote home, or an archaeologist uncovers artifacts to try to understand a culture, all of that does create knowledge. We do learn about a culture, we learn about people and history through these artifacts and these documents. However, they were not created for the purpose of our study. So there's a little bit more of us kind of trying to figure out what's going on, and being left with a lot of empty questions, empty lack of answers, because we weren't able to ask those pointed questions or to do those observations ourselves. So all in all, long story short, interviews, whenever we are directly asking somebody something, either in person, over the phone, via email, one person or multiple people, if we are directly giving a prompt to someone for a response, it's an interview. Observations are whenever we're watching people, watching what they do, what they say. Document analysis is whenever we're using data that has previously been collected, that has been created not for the purpose of our study. However, it could maybe help us understand something related to our research question. So these are the three kinds of data: interviews, observations, document analysis, or artifact analysis, however you want to talk about it, are our three types. So if we see this in the exam, you should be able to tell me what are the three kinds of data that we collect and we use in qualitative research. I'm going to do a couple more videos for this module, one looking at the research cycle as it applies to qualitative research, and another one talking a little bit about the types of qualitative approaches. So if you have any questions, let me know. If you don't, I'll see you in the next video.